Thanks everyone for being here. We're very excited to talk to you today about open data for socio-ecological equity with the Curbcut platform. My name is David Walksmith. I'm the Canada Research Chair in Urban Governance at McGill University, and I'm an Associate Professor in the School of Urban Planning as well. And I'm one of the co-leads of the Curbcut project at McGill. I'm joined here by Maxime Bélanger-Dubois, who's our Head of Technology. We're going to do a bilingual presentation today. I'll present in English. Maxime will present in French. The slides are all in English, but if you'd like a French copy of them, please feel free to get in touch with us. In a little bit, we're going to talk about the Curbcut platform itself. It's a platform for deep, dynamic, and intuitive exploration of urban sustainability. And actually, I can say an award-winning platform because we were the recipient of the Canadian Open Data Excellence Award from the Canadian Open Data Society last year, which we're very proud of. Curbcut is a tool we've been developing to visualize and contextualize relationships, environmental relationships, social relationships, and kind of the intersection of the two in Canadian cities and regions. And just to give you a kind of a quick sneak peek of what the tool looks like, here's one of our pages exploring active living potential in the Montreal region. We're going to get into the tool in a bit, but first what we're going to do is talk through some of the considerations around mobilizing open data to address issues of socio-ecological equity in Canadian cities and regions. And you know, maybe this is the part of the presentation that for a different audience would probably take a long time. I think for this room I don't need to talk really about the kind of the promise of open data so much, except just to note, you know, even just today, this morning, hearing about the geo.ca platform from the federal government, they're mentioning 5,000 data sets they have available. I believe the stat we heard from the Canadian Open Data Society, they're tracking 38,000 different data sets in their metadata tracker. We live in an age of unbelievable proliferation of open data. You know, you name the issue, there's a good chance there's a data set out there that speaks to it. And that's fantastic, and it's particularly, I want to say selfishly, fantastic for somebody like me, you know, a researcher who really knows how to work with data. You know, it's what I spend my days doing. I love making maps. I love, you know, crunching numbers. But that, so much of the promise, I think, of open data now, but also into the future, has to do with making sure that the insights from open data and actually the data itself is broadly available to everybody, including folks without the PhDs and the advanced training and the research skills, right? And that our conviction is that this is particularly true in the domain of socio-ecological issues, what we're calling socio-ecological equity. And by this, what we mean is the connection between different, between variation in environmental effects on communities and social, and the variation in social data. So, you know, more specifically, access to good environmental things, to environmental amenities, varies quite a lot. You know, spatially and varies demographically. And it's also true that exposure to environmental bads also varies quite a lot. And answering questions related to those kind of to the distribution of good and bad environmental things very often requires us not just to have that one data set about where pollution is located, but to be able to connect that data on pollution with other data, demographic data from the census, data on traffic patterns, data on who knows what. So that so much of the kind of what the promise of open data for us looks like in the socio-ecological domain has to do with how we can connect multiple data sets, bring them together, and make them available for everybody. So to talk through some of the kind of challenges that, let's say, are on the table because of how fragmented the open data landscape looks like, Maxime is going to take us through some examples.
Merci, David. Donc, comme David a mentionné au début de la présentation, la présentation visuelle va demeurer en anglais, mais moi, je vais m'exprimer en français. Donc, au sujet du défi de la fragmentation, on fait référence ici à la difficulté de traiter et d'intégrer des sources de données qui sont super hétérogènes. Et ça rend difficile l'intégration de toutes ces sources-là dans une plateforme qui se veut complète, cohérente, qui se veut exhaustive. Donc, par exemple, si on veut répondre à la question de comment les risques climatiques sont-ils répartis au travers des communautés montréalaises, bien, si on veut répondre à ce type de questions-là, au moins, très bonne nouvelle, le portail de données ouvertes de la Ville de Montréal a un jeu de données qui existe déjà. La Ville de Montréal a développé ce jeu de données-là à une granularité qui est vraiment précise. Le jeu disponible sur leur portail y inclut des informations au sujet de la sécheresse, les vagues de chaleur les plus abondantes, entre autres, et c'est disponible à une échelle à une très haute résolution qui est des mailles de 25 mètres par 25 mètres. Et certaines populations sont, par exemple, plus vulnérables aux vagues de chaleur, les personnes plus âgées vivant seules. Donc, ce serait vraiment intéressant de pouvoir faire une comparaison directe avec le recensement canadien. Même chose, deuxième question, si on veut répondre à qui a physiquement accès aux établissements d'enseignement à Vancouver, contrairement à Montréal, ici, il y a beaucoup plus de travail à faire. On a accès, encore une fois, à un jeu de données qui a déjà été fait et compilé par Statistique Canada dans ce cas-ci, qui intègre tous les établissements d'enseignement au pays. Et un point sur la carte seul, en fait, ce n'est pas une mesure d'accessibilité. Donc, on sait qu'on va avoir besoin de jeux de données davantage pour pouvoir répondre à notre question, comme le réseau des rues de OpenStreetMap. On va pouvoir dire d'un point d'origine à la destination, ça prend 17 minutes à pied, à vélo ou en auto de se rendre à notre destination, à l'établissement d'enseignement. Et ensuite de ça, pour répondre ultimement à la question qui a justement accès à ces établissements-là, on peut utiliser le recensement des populations canadiennes pour justement dire quelle population il y a plus ou moins accès. Donc, du côté de la question de Montréal, on a des rasters versus des géographies du recensement. Du côté de Vancouver, on a plusieurs jeux de données qu'on sait qu'on va avoir besoin pour répondre à notre question, mais ce n'est pas donné au commun des mortels d'être capable de tout prendre ces jeux de données-là, de faire tous les calculs nécessaires et d'avoir les réponses à nos questions. Donc, en général aussi, on a souvent besoin de beaucoup plus d'un jeu de données pour pouvoir répondre à ce type de questions de recherche-là. Et pour arriver à nos fins, alors qu'est-ce qu'on fait? Nous, pour relever le défi de la fragmentation, nous, on a mis au centre de notre préoccupation l'interopérabilité. Donc, on veut unifier les données hétérogènes en un seul outil qui est cohérent, qui est navigable, qui est puissant. Et justement, l'interopérabilité va permettre à tous ces ensembles de données-là très hétérogènes qui proviennent de différents secteurs, qui sont générés à différentes échelles, de dialoguer ensemble, de pouvoir se parler. On a vraiment besoin de cette pièce-là pour terminer le puzzle. C'est normal que les jeux de données ne sont pas directement comparables. La Ville de Montréal, par exemple, pour revenir à notre exemple plus tôt, la Ville de Montréal a fait un excellent travail pour récupérer la donnée à la plus haute résolution possible. Puis du côté du recensement, c'est normal que les géographies du recensement, la Statistique Canada a de très bonnes raisons d'utiliser les géographies qu'il utilise. Donc, c'est cette différence-là, quand même, qui fait de l'interopérabilité la prochaine étape pour répondre à ces questions-là. Ce n'est pas un luxe, c'est juste nécessaire. Donc, si on est capable de développer un outil comme ça qui met l'interopérabilité au centre de ses préoccupations, ça va permettre de faire des comparaisons directes, ça va nous permettre de faire des analyses qui vont être très riches, ultimement qui vont pouvoir éclairer des prises de décision sans nécessairement avoir de connaissances en préalable techniques en système d'information géographique ou en sciences de données. Je vais repasser la parole à David qui va nous parler des tensions de l'interopérabilité et de notre solution. Merci.
All right, so our ambition is to try to kind of solve this question, at least in our own modest corner of the world, to say what does it look like to design a system that lets many different data sets kind of speak to each other, and where we can get the insights at the intersection of different patterns of social variation, of environmental variation. And specifically, what we're building is a tool for geovisualization. So for seeing things on maps, for understanding spatial patterns. And we think that there are several kind of tensions which are inherent to this task, which we'd like to explore for a second. I think that one way to illustrate them, and not picking on anybody here, is to look at an example of a municipal OpenJS portal. This is the city of Toronto. It's a great tool. The city has pulled together a whole set of spatial data sets related to governance in Toronto. So we can see the zoning, we can see the distribution of infrastructure and the rest of that. And if you know what you're doing, there's a lot that you can get here, but mainly there's a lot you can get here, if you know what you're doing, right? You can access data layers, you can take them for yourself and go do interesting analyses with them. And we surveyed the field of these types of tools, and what we kind of kept feeling like was Jason and the Argonauts. So I don't know who's familiar with the Greek mythology here, but in the story of Jason and the Argonauts, Jason's got, Hercules has got the whole gang on this ship. And at one point they have to cross, pass through this section of, the sea, where on the one side is Scylla and the other side is Charybdis. So we've got a huge whirlpool. If you get too close, you get pulled in. On the other side, there's a huge monster. If you get too close, it eats all your crew. And the challenge is to avoid both dangers, to kind of find that path in the middle. And, in the realm of designing tools for geovisualization of lots of different types of data, we've got our Scylla and our Charybdis, which is kind of a set of choices that that we have to make that that kept us thinking, can we just do both? Can we just get through the middle and not get eaten by the monster and also not fall into the whirlpool? So on the one hand, the tension between breadth and depth. If we have a tool that aggregates a whole bunch of data sets, we can do that in a way that really has that breadth, makes a lot available, but usually that comes at the cost of being able to dive really deep on any one of those pieces of information. Likewise, we've got a tension between flexibility and intuitiveness. I work with that all day long. I would love to I want the most possible options available to me. I want every tool. But of course, presenting me with every tool means it's good, the barrier to entry is a lot higher. It's harder to kind of understand what you're doing. You lose that intuitiveness. And then in a kind of different register, but also very important, is the kind of tension between quantitative and qualitative data. A lot of data sets that we work with and that, that have been made available, they're quantitative, and that's important. But, in our domain of socio-environmental questions and more broadly, stories matter too. So there's qualitative data that speaks to people's lived experiences of the patterns that are, aggregated with numbers, and, we kind of have to choose one or the other. Or do we? That's what we're up to is trying to, again, to kind of avoid the whirlpool and avoid the monster. Can we design a system with breadth and depth, with flexibility and intuitiveness, with quantitative and qualitative data, so that instead our trip looks a little more like this, smooth sailing, clear waters, that kind of thing, right? And, I think the answer is we can do this. And we've got a solution we want to talk about that I think rises, at least to some extent, to some of these challenges. And what we're going to describe is a system that pulls together open data from a whole set of different providers, a really heterogeneous range of different types of data, and produces something meaningful to understand the kind of the intersections and the overlaps between all these different data sets. And this is what Curbcut is. It's as I said before, it's a platform for deep, dynamic, and intuitive exploration of urban sustainability. And again, one more preview before we take you through the tool itself. Here we've got a page looking at the distribution of active living potential in the Montreal region. So this is the extent to which the built environment supports active lifestyles. And on the left, you can choose all sorts of ways. You can kind of tweak how you want to see this data or compare it with other things. On the right, we have some information to help you contextualize what you're looking at. In the middle, you have a nice, beautiful map. We're going to do some live demos to show you how the tool works and how it can help us understand and explore questions of socio-ecological equity in a sec. But first, I want to give you kind of a little bit of a kind of peek inside the box in terms of how we've designed the system and how it works. And I'll just say, I'm just going to go at like absolute light speed here. There's a ton of detail that we love to talk about. So please, in the Q&A, let us have it, or ambush us afterwards. But at a very high level, the system we've designed has kind of is a stack of 4 elements. At the bottom is data, and our ambition is if there's any spatial component to the data, and it speaks to questions of social or environmental issues in Canadian regions and cities, we want it. So we want polygons, we want points, we want lines, we want point-in-time data, we want time series data, but we also want narratives, we want photos, we want videos. We want it all. What we do is we take all the data sets we can access, and we process them through what we describe as a multi-scalar data architecture. So a kind of a system for making different data sets comparable. Allow them to kind of communicate with each other flexibly. And the key idea here is that we don't know ahead of time what types of comparisons and manipulations are going to be important. We want a system that can flexibly kind of, where we can kind of not have to make that choice right now, and let users make that choice, for example. And the way we do that is, and this is the part that I'm going to spend a bit more time describing, is through a series of what we can think of as rules for how to process different types of data and make them understandable through visualizations, through text, through analysis. And then lastly, because they're so, they're kind of exponential possibilities of how different data sets interact with each other, we kind of curate these results with a set of kind of topic-specific pages. So I showed you one on active living potential in the Montreal region, but we've got a whole bunch of these and many more coming. So I want to just zoom in on this third level here, composable and extensible methods for visualization and analysis. What am I talking about here? Well, the issue is like this. If someone came to me and Max earlier, like a week or two ago, with one of the scenarios that he posed a few minutes ago, saying, the city of Montreal has this amazing data set on exposure to climate risk, and actually there was a great presentation they gave this morning talking through it, which was really cool to see. And somebody wants to know, kind of dig deeper into that issue. So, for example, we know there are all sorts of risk factors from academic research about, exposure to heat. Old folks, people living alone, are some of the examples. But we've got this data set. Can you figure out what patterns there are in the way that exposure to climate risk relates to other, say, well-known aspects of vulnerability, or other patterns that we maybe weren't expecting at all? Well, the good news is we can do it. Like we know how. We can take the data, we can clean it, we can process it. We know how to apply our expert judgment to figure out what types of graphs to make, what types of maps to make, and how to design a final output that will be legible. But there's only so much of us to go around, and if we've got kind of hundreds or thousands of versions of that type of question, where we just don't have enough kind of expert judgment. So what we want instead is a system of rules that says, if we have this type of information, here's a good set of ways to process and display it, and if we have this type of information, here's another set of ways to do that. So we took inspiration from, if there are any programmers in the room, from a system in object-oriented programming, the idea of classes and methods. And without using too much jargon, the notion here is that any variable in a data set, in our data sets, or combinations of variables, we can kind of assign those classes. Like, so for example, one of the ones I'll talk about is the percentage of households which are occupied by tenants. That type of data, it's continuous. It's a bunch of numbers. They vary from 0 to 100%, and it's got a kind of even continuous distribution. Different types of data have different classes. They have different kind of properties. And what we do is we define a set of rules or methods for how to visualize and analyze different types of data based on the classes which are present. And so these are what are called methods. So the idea is we've written a whole series of visualization analysis functions which, as long as we declare ahead of time, this is the type of data we're working with, then downstream, we're going to get good-looking and meaningful outputs. And the good news here is that as we add new types of data, we add new types of methods, and the system scales really nicely. So the very first time we encountered raster data, we have to put some new methods in place, and we do that, and then et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So as an example here, this is a really simple one, but I think it kind of shows the promise. Here we've got, just as promised, the percentage of households at the census tract level occupied by tenants. If we want to show kind of a quick visual summary of this distribution, the statisticians know what you do is you make a histogram. The height of your bar is the number of observations, and because we've got a continuous data set here, we put in labels on the x-axis from 0 to 100%, and our histogram looks quite nice. We have another data set which I already mentioned, our active living potential index, which is also continuous, but it's an index. It doesn't have kind of inherent numerical values that are meaningful. Instead, it goes from low to high. There's low active living potential, there's high active living potential, right? So with this type of data, we can also make a histogram, but we need kind of a slightly different presentation of this. We need to have an axis that doesn't have numbers on it, it has labels. And then if we're using Montreal's climate risk data, which we saw before and which we're going to see again, this is a ranked data set. It's categorical. We don't have, there's a kind of order from insignificant risk to minor to moderate to elevated to major. But now we can't use a histogram. We don't have continuous data. We need a bar chart. And again, people who make graphs, we all know how to do this, right? But this idea of kind of coming up with rules for different types of data and then outputs that correspond to those rules can be extended to more complicated situations as well. So for example, if we want to compare two of these data sets, these variables, we need rules for that too. So we got tenant occupied, the percentage of households occupied by tenants, and we've got the potential for active living. And if we want to see how the covariation between these two variables, well, we've got two continuous data sets, we make a scatter plot. And so that's what we see here. And then we can see actually very clearly there's a pretty strong positive correlation between the amount of tenants there are in a neighborhood and the potential for active living, which kind of makes sense if you think about the type of built environment where we're more likely to see apartments as opposed to single-family homes, right? That's an easy one. But if we want to compare one of our continuous variables with one of our categorical variables like drought vulnerability, we can't make a scatter plot. Instead, we have to make, this is one of my favorite types of charts, a box plot, where we can see the distribution of the percentage of households occupied by tenants within each category of drought vulnerability. Different types of data, but we also see a pretty clear pattern here, right? Areas with more tenants have a higher exposure to drought vulnerability in the Montreal region. This is great, right? But the same exact philosophy of we have classes of data and of data combinations, and then we can write rules to describe how to work with them, also applies to text. So here are three kind of quick summary paragraphs describing the three data sets that we were looking at before, at a very high level. And again, we didn't write these, we wrote a system that writes these, if that makes sense, right? And in each case, it kind of zeroes in on the kind of the key relationship, the key pattern, the key information in hopefully pretty understandable English or French, the system's bilingual. And the same system extends to the more complicated situations. So I flagged that on the graph, it was pretty clear there was a really a strong relationship between the percentage of households who are tenants and the potential for active living in the built environment. Well, the text that describes this relationship flags that as well. It says strong correlation, and then in, I think very readable language, in the Montreal region, boroughs or cities with a higher potential for active living almost always have a higher percentage of private households occupied by tenants. It even gives you the Pearson correlation coefficient if you want it. So this is how the Curbcut system works in a nutshell. We take lots of different data, we stick it together to make it comparable and flexible, and then we've written a whole set of these kinds of rules to make it in a kind of automated but not, I think not kind of cold and machine-like way to make the kind of the patterns meaningful in this data. And so now what we're going to do is take you through some examples of how this works in practice. So normally I would show this on the actual site, but other people's computers, bad manners. So we got kind of little videos here of us using the actual site. At the end, I'll give you the link. Everybody can go visit it on their own. And we're going to come back to climate change risk in Montreal. We've been talking about it for the whole presentation. We're going to keep talking about it for a little bit longer. So here is the climate change risk page in the Montreal version of Curbcut. This is a data set which comes from the city of Montreal. I'll talk about that in a second, but basically what we're looking at is a map showing the distribution of drought vulnerability across the city. On the left, we've got controls for changing how the data is displayed, and on the right, we have additional information about the data set to help us kind of make sense of the patterns. Now, just to be clear, what we're dealing with here is right now is an open data set from the City of Montreal, which is from two climate change modeling exercises in 2015 and 2023. And the data is very high resolution. It's collected at the 25-meter raster scale. And just again to kind of tie back in with what I was talking about all the different rules, what we see here just as the kind of anatomy of the page is we've got a variable, or I said heat wave vulnerability, is actually drought vulnerability right now. And it's got a class, which is its ranked data or ordinal data, for the wonks. So this class has a whole set of methods or rules for how the data is going to be displayed. So there's a color method, which is then we've got this ranked data. We're going to display the data in blue on a kind of low to high scale, and the legend will work in that way as well. We'll have 5 bins of different shades of blue with labels on them to show what the bins mean. The graph method's a bar chart. We can't do a histogram because we only have 5 categories. We do a bar chart instead. And then there's a text method which writes that kind of that summary paragraph about the information. So all this stuff's going to change as we go, but just I wanted to kind of get it kind of clear in your head as we proceed. Okay, so we were looking at drought vulnerability, but there are multiple variables in this in the climate risk activity. So we could see heavy rain vulnerability, and now we're going to settle on heat waves, which is where we'll stay for the rest of this demo. If we zoom in to the map, what happens is we replace our pixels with kind of finer and finer resolution pixels. So the data is collected at the 25-meter scale. We show it at a kind of a more aggregated scale to begin with to kind of make it a little more easy to see. But you zoom in, you get a kind of consistent presentation of detail. And when we zoom in far enough, we get these 25-meter pixels. You can click on one of them, and because it's very fine grained, we actually can kind of put an approximate address to that. So the explanatory text updates to describe what's going on in this particular location in terms of the variable, which is heat wave vulnerability, but also in terms of how this location relates to the rest of the city. So it says in the 25-meter grid area around 4459 Rue Saint-Denis, Montreal, the vulnerability to climate change-related heat waves is elevated. And then it says this is unusually vulnerable for the island of Montreal, and goes on to give additional information. And you can see that the graph has been updated to put a line showing where our selection is located in that graph. So, you've got the kind of big picture pattern of the city. You zoom in, you choose a location, and now you get the small picture pattern of that location contextualized in the big picture pattern of the city. We've got more we can do, though, because this is the City of Montreal did their exercise of climate vulnerability modeling twice. They did it in 2015 and again in 2023. Actually, the data was for 2022. So we can compare dates. And of course, if we have data sets with many more points in time, this comparison can get quite a lot more granular, right? But what we've now done is switched over into our comparison mode. And we're now seeing the change in heat wave vulnerability over the 2015 to 2022 period in Montreal. And what we see is a lot of orange, and what our legend tells us is that means vulnerability is increasing. So the big picture here is that the vulnerability to heat waves in Montreal has increased quite a lot in the last 8 years, which I think is no surprise. We know climate change has been coming. In fact, all of the methods have been updated to kind of reflect the fact that we've got a new data set that we're displaying. So now, instead of just at one point in time, we're showing the change in heat wave vulnerability over an 8-year period. And so now we've got this ranked data still, but it's longitudinal. So we have new methods to display this new type of data. Importantly, we've got this purple-orange color scale. It's colorblind safe, and it doesn't have normative implications where one color means bad and one color means good. Instead, purple means decrease, orange means increase. So our legend changes as well. We center that legend on no change, which is gray, pretty clear to see. We can't do a bar chart anymore. Instead, we give a heat map for the graph, which is a nice type of visualization to show change between several different categories. And lastly, the explanatory text has been updated as well. So we can compare dates if we want, but again, we've got this multi-scalar data architecture that lets us be very flexible with how we present the data. So what we've now done is we've switched over from this raster grid to census geographies. What we're seeing now is census CSDs and municipalities and boroughs on the island of Montreal. And if we zoom in, we can switch over to census tracts, and of course you can control this manually if you want. So we're going to move over to the dissemination area scale to get a really nice high-resolution view of climate risk, but one that is now enumerated according to political boundaries, or excuse me, the administrative boundaries, like the census boundaries. And why would we want to do this? Well, the reason ties back to what I was talking about at the beginning of the presentation, which is that so often issues of exposure to environmental vulnerability, to exposure to environmental good things, they're important because they overlap with other patterns of social variation. And the census is a really good source of information about demographic patterns of demographic variation. So often we don't want to see raster pixels. We want to know about census tracts, or we want to know about municipal boundaries, or we want to know about dissemination areas. And so with our multi-scalar data architecture, we use aerial interpolation to kind of recast the data collected at the raster scale into census boundaries instead, to enable this flexible comparison between different spatial units. So in this case, what we're doing is we're aggregating from those 25-meter grid cells up to census geographies. Now that we're here, and of course we could do the same comparison with the pixels if we want, we can compare the exposure to heat wave vulnerability with patterns of variation in the census. And in particular, previous research, for example, Eric Kleinenberg's great book, Heat Wave, has shown that people who live alone are at a high level of, they have a high chance of having adverse outcomes in heat waves because they don't have the social supports to draw on. So this is we've now chosen a comparison between heat wave vulnerability and the percentage of households which have a sole occupant on the island of Montreal. And so everything's changed. We've got new methods to display this new type of data. And what it shows, in a nutshell, is a moderate positive correlation between these two things. So just to read the text, the system says it better than I will. On the island of Montreal, dissemination areas with a higher vulnerability to climate change-related heat waves tend to have a higher percentage of one-person households out of total households. And it says there's a moderate positive correlation. We can see the coefficient. So we get some evidence right away that there's an important pattern of covariation between heat wave vulnerability and what we know to be a kind of a category of interest. And we can do this again for a different, if we want to look at this data in kind of a different way. Right now we've been looking at the map, but of course this is, it's a quantitative data set. We can also flip over to a table view and see the data as a table. And there's an interactive table, you can sort it, you can select something, you can do what you want with it. But this, when we're in table view, the other great thing is that we have access to more information. We can give you some kind of descriptive statistics about the data set, tell you where the data comes from, tell you what kind of processing we did to put it on the map, and then also let you export it. So you can, there's a nice black button there for download as a CSV or download as a shapefile. So you can take the data set once you've kind of got it organized on the screen the way you want it, and take it with you for future use. We selected a row on our table. If we flip back to the map now, we'll see that that selection has been maintained. You can flip between the map and the table view and continue to play around. What we're now going to do is look at another comparison variable, which is older adults. This has been identified in research as another key category of vulnerability for heat issues. And what we see in this case is there is no systematic relationship spatially between exposure to heat waves and the presence of older adults, which is kind of a good news from a policy perspective. But the map lets us zoom, kind of, if we want to play around with in terms of what the colors are showing us, areas where there might be exceptions to that broader pattern. So in a nutshell, with just a couple minutes here, what we've been able to show, in addition to just show off this really cool data set that the City of Montreal has put together, right? You can play with it, we've got it, it's nice. But to go deeper than what is usually possible by looking at the data on its own, we've been able to show with a longitudinal comparison that heat wave risk is getting worse in the Montreal region. Not a surprise, but we've got the receipt, so to speak. We've also shown that heat wave risk is highly correlated with living alone, but it's not correlated with old age prevalence. And importantly, all the relevant data is ready for export and further analysis if you want it. So we've got a tool which I think is approachable and kind of easy to use, but also lets you dig deeper on your own if you want to, because we're working with open data. We can process it up, package it up, and send you on your way with it. I want to do a quicker demonstration now, flipping from coast to coast. So we're heading from Montreal to Vancouver. We've been working with the Ministry of Housing here in BC on a pilot project. We're building a version of Curbcut for 5 different regions in BC. This isn't publicly available yet. This is the Montreal one's online. This is coming soon, but I'm going to give you the sneak peek. And we're going to talk about a different question of socio-ecological equity right now, which is access to amenities in Vancouver. So this is the access to amenities page in the Vancouver Curbcut. And what we're looking at right now is people's access to grocery stores on foot. So the map is showing at the census tract scale how many grocery stores on average, an average resident of a census tract has access to with 20 minutes of walking. And the answer from our explanatory text is in the Vancouver region, a resident has access to on average 13 grocery stores within a 20-minute walk. Now, this is a really cool data set that we've put together. And actually, we built our own accessibility data set here, which has countrywide coverage at the dissemination area scale and up for accessibility to a huge range of different amenities for walking, cycling, public transit, and driving at 5-minute time increments, and in comparison with a huge range of other variables. And so in total, actually, we're talking about more than 15 billion data points. I just say that number, ooh, it's a big number, but the point about it is that it's a huge number, but we, I think, have made a tool which makes it actually not too overwhelming. You can figure out you don't need 15 billion data points, you need maybe like 1,500. We can get you to those 1,500 pretty quickly, and then you can take them and go on your way, or you can just play with the maps, right? So we built this accessibility data set using Statistics Canada's open databases of facilities, the educational facilities, healthcare facilities, and cultural and art facilities. We use the census, we use OpenStreetMap for the routing. We also supplemented the amenity data with data from DMTI. And so, okay, let's dig into this a little bit. We've got this, a slider here where you can choose the threshold of transportation time you want to see to change, the accessibility threshold. So we've moved it from 20 minutes to 30 minutes. I have to say, sometimes I'm a little stressed out, I just load this page and just slide that slider. I see these blue areas. It's very meditative, I find. But it's really responsive. You can see whatever thresholds you want. Right now we're looking at grocery stores, but what we can do is let's switch on over to schools. Now we're just looking at all schools right now. If you want, you can drill down kind of as far as you want, basically. You want to see primary schools, you want to see public schools, whatever. We've got it all. And we see again a similar pattern where there are kind of hot spots of access to schools on foot, which is what we'd expect, right? Dense parts of the city, there's going to be more schools available on foot than in less dense parts of the city. So let's dig a little bit deeper here. Let's switch over to public transit. And when we switch over to public transit, we have the additional choice of what timing we want, because public transit access varies quite a lot depending on the time of day. So let's switch over to weekday traffic peak. This is the time when most people are taking transit to get to school or to get to work and both. And we now see, again, the pattern of accessibility to schools by public transit in the Vancouver region. We see that if you look at the graph on the right, you see that there's a kind of zero weighting to this data now. There are a lot of census tracts which don't have any schools accessible in public transit because they don't have any public transit, right? But on the whole, we otherwise see a kind of a pretty normal distribution. What we're going to do now is just kind of zoom in on this to the dissemination area scale so we can get a bit more of a fine-grained perspective. And we see the same pattern, but now we have a lot more zeros in our data set, right? Because once we zoom in far enough, there are plenty of areas which really don't have good enough public transit access to get you to a school. Now that's maybe a problem, but realistically, it's only really a problem if people count on public transit to get where they need to go, right? So this data set on its own is great. It tells you about how many schools you can access, but it doesn't really answer the question of, is this a problem or not? Because that has to do with who uses public transit in their daily life, who relies on public transit, and so whose life is made harder by not being able to access those schools compared to the people who say, well, I wouldn't even know where to take the bus if my life depended on it, right? Like people who they're not using transit. So what we're going to do here is we are going to compare the distribution or the accessibility to schools by public transit with the number of people who take public transit to get to work every day. It's a reasonable measure of kind of how much communities rely on public transit. And what we see here is a positive correlation. So it's kind of a good news story at a high level, which is that in the Vancouver region, dissemination areas with more schools accessible by public transit also have more people who rely on public transit. It's kind of what we'd want to see, right? But what we also see is if we look at the map, if we pay attention to the green areas on the map, the green areas are the areas that have lots of transit use, but not a lot of accessibility to schools. And the blue areas are vice versa, right? Not a lot of transit use, but a lot of accessibility. And what we see is that even in this, in the city of Vancouver, you don't have to go to the suburbs. There are plenty of places, parts of the city, where there is a high level of reliance on public transit, and yet it's very hard to access educational facilities using public transit. So those are kind of like the equity gaps that this map shows up. So kind of the one big picture finding is, on the whole, we've got kind of see what we'd want to see from a policy perspective, which is areas with good accessibility to schools by transit also have good, lots of people using, but then we also see the exceptions. So now I'm going to hand it over for our final demo and our conclusion to Maxime.
Merci encore, David. Donc, on va parler des ruelles vertes à Montréal. Pour cette page-là, on utilise 4 jeux de données, une qui provient du portail de données ouvertes de la Ville de Montréal, qui est vraiment une mine d'or pour les données ouvertes à Montréal. On a fait des visites sur le terrain aussi pour classifier chacune des ruelles comme étant vertes, ruelles vertes communautaires, mixtes ou non maintenues. Et on a recueilli des infos auprès de chacun des arrondissements et aussi on a utilisé le recensement pour ajouter une dimension sociodémographique à l'analyse. Donc, regardons la page. Sur la page, en fait, toutes les lignes de couleur qu'on voit, c'est des ruelles vertes à Montréal. Si je clique sur une d'entre elles, j'ai de l'information sur la date d'inauguration. Par exemple, celle-ci, elle a été inaugurée il y a plus de 20 ans. Si elle est ouverte ou fermée à la circulation. Et on a aussi notre équipe qui a pris une photo. Comme on le voit ici, cette ruelle verte-là, elle est très verte. La prochaine ruelle, j'augmente mon débit de voix parce que je sais qu'on est pressé par le temps. Là. La prochaine ruelle que je vous montre, c'est une ruelle qui est non maintenue, qu'on a classifiée comme étant non maintenue. Celle-ci, elle est ouverte à la circulation. Et justement, comme on voit sur la photo qui a été prise par notre équipe, les visites sur le terrain, en fait, ça nous permet d'avoir une nouvelle perspective, une perspective de plus sur le vrai état de ces lieux-là. On a recueilli, comme j'ai dit, des informations auprès de chacun des arrondissements. Donc, le prochain mode que je vais vous montrer, c'est sur chacun des arrondissements. Donc, on a 13 arrondissements à Montréal qui ont un programme de ruelles vertes. Si je clique sur un des arrondissements, Ville-Marie, par exemple, là, on a de l'information sur la date d'inauguration de la première ruelle verte. On a des informations aussi qui détaillent ce qui est nécessaire, les marches à suivre pour faire sa propre ruelle verte, et aussi un lien vers le guide d'aménagement d'une ruelle verte dans chacun de ces quartiers-là. Comme on a vu dans les précédentes démonstrations, c'est vraiment important pour nous de permettre la comparaison avec des variables sociodémographiques. Donc, dans ce cas-ci, on a agrégé les ruelles vertes qui proviennent du portail de données ouvertes de la Ville de Montréal aux géographies du recensement. Puis ce qu'on voit, c'est la densité de mètres carrés de ruelles vertes par kilomètre carré. Donc, ça vaut la peine à ce moment-ci d'aborder une préoccupation qui est pertinente, qui est l'idée que les ruelles vertes sont des vecteurs de gentrification. C'est l'idée de la gentrification verte, là, que des améliorations environnementales peuvent avoir des conséquences involontaires comme l'augmentation des prix de loyer qui, à son tour, peut avoir une conséquence du déplacement des populations à revenus plus modestes. Donc, si on fait la comparaison puis on veut pouvoir répondre à cette question-là, on nie pas l'existence du phénomène du tout, mais à Montréal, par contre, Curbcut nous permet de voir qu'il n'y a pas de corrélation positive entre les deux variables. Et on a trouvé une corrélation modérée positive, par contre, avec une autre variable du sociodémographique, qui est l'éducation. Comme on voit ici, l'éducation est souvent utilisée comme un indicateur de capital social qui reflète aussi les liens, la force des liens communautaires. Puis pour créer une ruelle verte, ça prend une collaboration entre les voisins, ça prend des démarches communes auprès des instances municipales. Donc, on voit avec Curbcut, justement, ça suggère que des quartiers qui ont un capital social plus élevé semblent aussi avoir plus de succès dans la concrétisation d'un projet de ruelle verte. Les points de couleur que vous voyez, là, vous l'avez probablement vu depuis le début. Lorsqu'on zoome sur la carte, on a des bulles de couleur qui apparaissent. C'est des informations qualitatives. On a fait vraiment un gros travail pour récupérer des informations socio-écologiques, en fait, sur des histoires de Montréal. Cette bulle de couleur-ci, c'est le portrait, c'est une histoire sur les programmes de ruelles vertes à Montréal. Dans le plateau Mont-Royal, pardon. Donc, on a plusieurs façons de se rendre sur ces histoires qualitatives-là, sur ces données qualitatives-là. Ici, c'est un exemple de si je clique sur le point de couleur, ça nous emmène le document qui a été écrit par un membre de notre équipe. Et on a aussi développé du contenu audiovisuel pour justement enrichir l'histoire. Comme on le voit sur la carte ici, on a une vidéo YouTube qui fait un résumé en fait de ce contenu-là. Donc, on a 4 sources de données qui ont contribué à mettre en lumière les caractéristiques des programmes de ruelles vertes et en analysant au travers des prismes socio-écologiques, on a pu en quelques minutes déconstruire l'idée d'une corrélation positive entre la densité des ruelles vertes et le revenu, puis on a aussi pu mettre en lumière une corrélation avec le capital social. Donc, conclusion, je ne sais pas si je devrais faire la conclusion, or if we should, yeah, OK, conclusion. Donc, on a discuté des défis qu'on a dû relever pour faire un projet comme Curbcut. On a mis au centre de notre préoccupation l'interopérabilité pour pouvoir faire dialoguer les jeux de données qui proviennent de sources différentes. Et si on est capable, en fait, de combiner les tensions de l'interopérabilité plutôt que faire des choix, par exemple, entre la flexibilité, l'intuitivité, le quantitatif ou le qualitatif, on a aussi montré notre solution qui est l'approche Curbcut qui provient par la récupération des données nécessaires, l'intégration dans notre architecture de données multiscalaires, le développement des méthodes pour la visualisation de l'analyse s'ils ne sont pas déjà existantes et le développement des pages pour répondre à ces questions-là. Et on est allé sur les démonstrations. Les risques des changements climatiques à ruelle verte avec les corrélations avec le recensement, l'accessibilité à différents services de proximité à Vancouver et la densité des ruelles vertes à Montréal. Donc, je vais passer la parole à David qui va dire les mots de la fin. Puis espérons un peu de temps pour les questions.
So thanks a lot. If there's time for questions, I don't think there is, but you can get us in the hallway. But in the meanwhile, curbcut.ca/Montreal, it's the first version of the platform. We've got a lot of others under development, and we'd be super happy to talk about this. So thanks a lot for listening to us.
I'm really interested in the amenities for the city of Vancouver, considering that's my home and that's what I'm working on. From a data perspective, we do have an open data portal, but I feel like we can get a bit better at it. So for the next 15 minutes, I know it's sluggish. We are late in the afternoon, folks. It's 2:30, so take some time, take 15 minutes, get yourself fed and watered, a little bit of pep, and then we'll come back for the final leg of the first day of the 2023 Open Data Summit.